Welcome to Face to Face. This is a show about change and what's next. It's a show that asks questions and peels back the layers of our average everyday experience and goes beyond scratching the surface. We interview people doing incredible things who are making a difference around the globe. Join me as we listen in and get one step closer to understanding that big ideas shared create collaboration. Collaboration can inspire community, and communities create social change. I'm David Peck, and this is Face to Face. So my interview today is with Ian Gill. He is a journalist. I was going to say he's a former journalist. He's nothing of the sort. He's deeply involved with discourse media. He's an author. He's a writer. He's a thinker. He's a social change guru. Hey, Ian, can I call you that? He's written a book called No News is Bad News: Canada's Media Collapse and What Comes Next. This is, you're going to love Ian. You're going to fall in love with him. We talked about pretty much, we talked about pretty much everything. We talked about what the role of good journalism is really all about. It's about investigating. It's about informing. It's about inspiring. It's how, journalism can be, Ian says, a noble craft. We talked about opportunities and why he's still hopeful. We talked about how in the 21st century we're still using these 20th century institutions and solutions to look at the problems, global problems around the world. So this is about listening. It's about intelligent collaboration. It's about paying attention. So please stay tuned for my next interview coming right up with Ian Gill. DavidPeckLive.com for more face-to-face interviews. We are coming up on our 300th interview, I think, fairly soon. And Hot Docs is around the corner, and TIFF is coming up in the fall. You can find out more about my own writing and my public speaking there. Also, through patreon.com, you can choose to support what I'm doing with Face-to-Face as well. So, and don't forget rabble.ca for more podcasts coming soon to a theater near you. Ian Gill coming right up. No news is bad news. Well, welcome to Face to Face. We're joined by a very special guest here today with us, an author, a journalist, somebody who's clearly quite concerned about social change in its various forms. Ian Gill is here with us today to talk about his new book, No News is Bad News. Ian, thanks for joining us today.
It's great to be here, David.
So is it really as bad as you say? The subtitle of your new book is Canada's Media Collapse and What Comes Next.
Well, it's worse.
Okay, great start, Ian. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the book I wrote through some research I did in 2015 when I was a senior fellow at the McConnell Foundation, and they allowed me to go and roam the world a bit and think about what was happening in media, but specifically Canadian media. Mm-hmm. And so part of the book is a chronicle of just how bad it's gotten. And the thing about books, the timeline on publishing a book is, by the time it goes to the printers, there's a few weeks or months that intervene before it's on the shelves. And in those few weeks and months, things just kept getting worse. Mm-hmm. So, and in fact, continue to in many ways. So, it's a picture, a snapshot in time of things that were pretty dire in Canadian media, and frankly, I don't think it's improved that much and possibly have gotten worse. The subtitle of the book, as you say, though, is Canada's Media Collapse and What Comes Next. And the pivot I tried to make, because you can chronicle the decline of an industry like our media in this country till the cows come home. Mm-hmm. And it just becomes a sort of funeral dirge. What I tried to do was kind of pivot off that and say, well, it can't all be bad, and maybe there's some good things going on. And so I spend some of the book at least trying to think about that, and there are some glimmers of hope. It's still a pretty sad landscape out there in this country and frankly around the world, and then the advent of the Trump White House is just sort of dramatically sort of exaggerates what's going wrong around the world in terms of the public discourse generally.
This is not just a Canadian problem.
It's not a Canadian problem
right.
at all. No.
I love the book, by the way, Ian, and I have a family of journalists that I'm attached to. So I'm going to be forwarding out not only to my listeners but to some family members too.
Oh, good.
Ronald Wright says a blast of fresh air through the stale, half-empty corridors of Canadian journalism. Close quote. It's a great quote. Speaking of quotes, I'm going to read one from you. I'm going to read a couple probably throughout the book, but quote, how did things get so bad? Will they get worse? Should we even care anymore? And if so, what should we do about it? Someone once said that the environment is too important to leave to environmentalists, and the same should be said about journalism. Close quote. Your subtitle kind of leaves us open for some solutions and hope, and you do get into that near the end of the book and sort of woven throughout, really, frankly. And it sounds to me like it's quite a bit of doom and gloom, but there is things that we can do. There is a to-do list. There is a way to I don't know, I guess affect some pretty significant change, however incrementally. Is journalism over in a sense? Is it about people like myself who are posting on rabble.ca, who are getting out there and trying to interview people like you, or has like you say, the funeral dirge is playing?
Yeah, well, journalism is many things, and so I think some would say we're committing an act of journalism as we speak,
right?
By doing just what you're doing.
Sure.
Journalism to me is there's a number of definitions for it, but essentially at its base, it's practiced by people who are curious and who want to make sense of complexity and have some skill at you're translating that curiosity into narratives that people will respond to and possibly even take action on the basis of. And so when we're talking about social change, for instance, social change doesn't happen really without narratives that people are attracted to around why society should even change in the first place. And then, of course, how people act upon those beliefs is also sometimes a direct result of multiple acts of journalism or multiple acts of storytelling and knowledge mobilization. And in that area, journalism is in some ways the fastest, best way of moving ideas through the knowledge ecosystem and giving people an opportunity to select from them and decide they're going to act about this or that. Journalism in the conventional sense isn't dead yet. Frankly, journalism in the conventional sense, or as it's mostly practiced in this country through our sort of increasingly dull, pallid, and frankly unpalatable newspapers, and through this sort of superficial airhead TV that we have and everything else.
Yes.
Frankly, the sooner that dies, the better.
Wow.
Journalism's practice has become corrupted over the years, and I write in the book at one point about public interest journalism.
Yes, I was going to ask you about that. Yep.
Well, and to me, all journalism should have the public interest at its core. But the fact that we even have to sort of qualify what I talk about a bit in the book and what I'm now doing at my current company, Discourse Media, that the fact that we even have to qualify that as public interest journalism is sort of offensive in some ways.
So what, Ian? What is public interest journalism?
It's the notion. It's the notion that journalism is a public service. It exists in the public interest. But of course, that's true if you're serving up material that is actionable or motivating in some way around issues of public concern. If you're just putting cat pictures on a website in order to attract eyeballs, in order to attract advertisers, I don't conflate that with journalism.
Right.
And unfortunately, the populists that are running half the world now partly are there because of the descent of journalism into populist tropes that, frankly, we could do without. I don't consider a lot of journalistic practice over the last couple of decades as being, frankly, very much in the public interest. And I think that's what... So the opportunity here is actually an interesting one because journalism's kind of trust base has been somewhat eroded, and frankly, the business model for it's been somewhat eroded, and partly I think people have been offended by some of the journalistic practice over the last couple of decades. And so there's actually a huge opportunity here to say, well, okay, let's have the journalism we want,
right,
rather than just this tripe that's thrust down our throats. And so I'm quite excited about the potential to sort of almost redefine what journalism is.
Is it a two-sided coin, Ian? Is it public interest, corporate interest, or is it a way more nuanced than that?
Oh, I mean, corporate interest has always played a huge role, and that's actually one of the things that's so problematic in Canada. I mean, Canada, almost more than anywhere else in the world, has this just appallingly high level of ownership concentration. And so Postmedia, for instance, owns most of the papers across the country that the Toronto Star Corp doesn't own, and then between them all they own a whole bunch of silly little sort of metro dailies, sure, and dreadful weeklies out in the boonies and everything else. I mean, these are terrible products, but they have such a stranglehold on the concentration, on the ownership of these products, that it's very hard for anything to kind of come into the market against them. And as we've seen with Postmedia, they're just slashing journalists. I mean, more than 10,000 journalists have lost their jobs over the last few years, and so that's actual capacity on the ground. These are eyes and ears and minds that should be attuned to the public function and public discourse of our country that have just gone silent. So that's a problem, and that's a corporate problem.
You talk about blame and I guess responsibility, I suppose, to some degree, and you reference investors and technology and owners and regulators and so on. You're not a huge fan of the CBC, is that right?
Well, I worked for the CBC for 7 years, and I actually loved it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was.
You made me laugh out loud a couple of times with some of your commentary on CBC. That's for sure, and I'm sure, and I guess a lot of people would share in some of those frustrations. I guess maybe that's what it is.
Well, a lot of people at the CBC share in those frustrations. Right. I mean, the CBC is a national asset. There's no doubt about that.
Yes.
But there are pockets of the CBC that do extraordinarily good work, and there's some really good people working there. But boy, I mean, they're like miners down there, sort of several thousand feet under the ground with pit lamps, trying to find a corner where they can do good work in the gloom. Right. And that's partly the CBC is a big clunky organization that's slow to change and everything else.
Sure.
What's great about the CBC is we have this we have these channels, if you will, that the CBC has developed, these kind of communications channels, which are a piece of public infrastructure. They are just, the CBC's reach and its ability to be in a number of communities in a number of ways is just as important to this country as having pipes that run around, such that you can be in your apartment or your house and turn on the tap and clean water comes out. Doesn't work for a lot of Aboriginal people in this country, but it's also just as important as being able to flick a switch and have your electric light come on. So that is actually a piece of public infrastructure that we have invested heavily in over the years as taxpayers. And I think we should demand a lot more from. But I don't want to destroy the CBC. I mean, I think it is one of the defining institutions of this country. But boy, could it do with a shake-up.
Could it do with a shake-up? It kind of reminds me of the UN. I mean, a lot of the work I do, I hear about in fact, yesterday, a conversation with somebody in Toronto, and former CBC guy, actually, interestingly enough, and he was, kind of complaining about the UN, as was I, and does some wonderful, marvelous, amazing things. But wow, a shake-up is an understatement it could use with, that's for sure.
Well, and there's sort of every sector in our society, frankly. I mean, I'm not an anarchist, but I mean, people don't trust their institutions very much anymore. I mean, I think we sort of over-romanticize perhaps the fact that they ever have. But in the sort of post-war era, where there was this sort of rebuilding of the world and this sort of sense of optimism around politics to some degree, and I'm not going to get all dewy-eyed about the good old days, but Joshua Cooper-Ramo, for instance, has written beautifully about the extent to which people, we have these kind of essentially 20th century institutions now that are trying to confront 21st century problems and doing a really bad job of it.
Yeah.
And so we actually need, I mean, it's not just the CBC that needs shaking up, it's we need sort of shake-ups across the board. And what we need is these institutions to be much more responsive to the geopolitics of sort of world development and everything else. And part of the way to help that happen is to have really good journalism that holds them to account. I mean, that is the other real part of journalism's job, is not just to share hopeful narratives, but to actually, to use the name of a film that came out a couple of years, to use a spotlight on what's wrong. And, that's an important role, which, again, if you take 10,000 boots off the ground, or 20,000 boots, I guess, if most journalists wear a shoe on both feet, that's a lot of analytical journalistic capacity that's been removed from Canada and isn't being replaced in a whole heck of a hurry, and that's a problem.
I can't believe Donald Trump hasn't come up yet, by the way, but we'll get to that soon, I'm sure. So, quote...
who was that, sorry?
Donald Trump, yes. Yeah, nice. Quote, our ability to help shape a culture of innovation and to advance transformative change in Canada is hobbled by the narrowness of a national conversation that is constantly circumscribed by economic and political forces that are the antithesis of a transparent, engaged, and fully functioning democracy, close quote. That's in your introduction. I mean, that's gloves on to me, Ian, in a really good way. And so I want to talk about some of that responsibility. I mean, we can point fingers at the CBC and at the government and Harper and cuts and all that. What about me? What about me as somebody who has read, and I want to talk about Ben Bagdiki and some media monopoly as well. It's clearly played a huge role in your life, but at what level am I responsible for this mess we find ourselves in?
So, I mean, that takes a fair bit of unpeeling, but I have been I've been doing a lot of research on you, and I think your social habits are really to blame.
That's
no.
I think you could be right about that. Yeah.
Well, I think all of our social habits are partially to blame. No, I think that the issue is, to some degree, do Canadians, does anybody in the world, but do Canadians, just to narrow it to the subject of this book, do they actually think that journalism is important, and do they think that journalism should happen? There's a lot of Canadians, especially those in power, who'd be quite content to have things stay the way they are or get even worse because they're not under the scrutiny that they deserve, and they can get away, if not with murder, they can get away with pretty much everything up to that. And so Canadians have to sort of look in the mirror a little bit and think about whether or not they think journalism performs an important public function. And, the really critical thing is, if so, are they prepared to pay for it? Now, they pay for we pay for the CBC now, that's true. But the CBC is a thing, and it's got its own way of doing things, and it's not the only way of doing things. We are seeing that Canadians pay less than people in most developed countries for online journalism. For instance, they just, they are happy to consume online journalism. They're not happy to pay for it. Well, I'm working with a company now, Postmedia, whose job is to produce good quality online journalism, and we are still in our test phase and our kind of startup phase, so we haven't asked anybody to pay for it yet. But I worry very deeply that if we do, we may be a bit humbled by the response. And that's a conundrum for every jurisdiction. The New York Times is trying to find more inventive ways to get people to pay for its digital product because people are turning away from the newspaper. The Guardian is doing the same thing across Europe. There are people looking to kind of monetize journalism in the digital age. So Canadians, I guess, if they're to blame for anything, I think they can consider themselves complicit in the decline of journalism if they feel that they want journalism, but they're not prepared to pay for it. I don't think that's really exercising much social responsibility, frankly.
You talked about getting dewy-eyed. Are you the kind of guy who sits down on Saturday morning or every morning, frankly, with a coffee and a newspaper? I personally like the heart. I'm old enough to like the newsprint, the smell, the feel, everything about the experience. That's probably, I can blame my dad for that. But
Yeah.
is that completely going by the wayside? Are we going to see kind
No.
of a return to that, do you think, in some way? As we continue to seemingly, and I use the word in italics, consume more news.
Yeah, well, I have a confession to make, which is this morning when I woke up, I went and got my Globe and Mail and sat down with that and did the crossword.
Nice.
So that puts me into the sort of Pleistocene era or something. I don't know. I mean, I realize I'm fairly dinosaurish, but I do that, and yet I am right on the verge of cancelling my subscription to the Globe and Mail because I find it infuriating how poorly edited it is and how thin it is compared to the product that I was used to getting. And I say in the book at one point, I quote the head of Axel Springer, the big publisher in Germany, who said that he thinks within 10 years, and this was 2 years ago, newspapers will be as rare as kind of vinyl records. Now, vinyl records have had a comeback.
Exactly.
No, but so I think we'll have some newspapers in some places some of the time. And I don't even necessarily think it's just aging, dying boomers that are going to keep newspapers going. I mean, newspapers are a thing. Everyone heralded the death of books when e-books came in and everything else. I think the biggest threat to books is actually Netflix. It's not e-books, but in any event, I don't think we've seen the end of newspapers necessarily, but I do feel that people need to start taking digital media more seriously, and digital media needs to be more serious about what it's offering to Canadians or to people around the world as a platform for this public discourse to be continued.
I'm slowly trying to read more and more online news. iPad, I've got 4 or 5 sources that I go to pretty much every day for at least 15 or 20 minutes. One of the things that frustrates me, and maybe this is just, my old fartishness, but I don't like the format. And maybe, we can argue we don't have to argue, but a papered newspaper is a form of censorship because somebody chose what went into it. What I find kind of frustrating about the homepage of BBC or Al Jazeera or CBC is I don't know. It doesn't offer the variety that I need to see. Does that make any sense? Am I just showing up, my own laziness here?
No, absolutely not. It's just, I was having a conversation yesterday at Discourse about this with some of our. I mean, I'm the old guy in the room there. Everybody else is half my age, and they're brilliant, and they're all digital natives, and that's all they do. But, the conversation we were having yesterday is that virtually none of the young people that I work with who are sort of digital first in terms of their thinking and their reading and where they get their information, almost none of them go to a homepage anymore. So nobody actually, so you're showing your age by the very fact that you will go to the homepage of the BBC or the homepage of Al Jazeera. There sort of are no go-tos anymore because what's really starting to happen is because largely driven by social media, but also just generally the way people are starting to consume, and the way that actually good, intelligent distributors of information now are seeing their role as sort of curating product to people. There's sort of more push than pull happening now. So, especially because of the sort of computer algorithms that will drive people to certain places because they've been seen to go there before and that's their sort of product of choice. I could spend an entire day now consuming different articles and short videos, if you will, or audio product and everything else, without ever really going to a homepage at all, just because of how I show up on social media and everything else. I'm sent as opposed to going looking for more information than I could possibly consume in a day. And I think that's where the change is occurring. And that's where some opportunity, I believe, arises in terms of monetizing sort of distribution because it's so hard to monetize the production of content.
At what point, though, do I, as the reader, Ian, just get I'm exhausted by that, aren't I? I mean, I just unsubscribed from one news agency this morning again on my, too much in my inbox. There's too much noise out there, Ian. How the heck do I filter it? I kind of rely on a good editor to do that for me.
Well, and so I think in the end we need to be disciplined as consumers about what we sort of let in through the door.
Sure.
One of the problems, though, and this has been sort of studied, and it's particularly been debated in the context of what happened in the White House in the last few months in American politics, is if we just allow the sort of algorithms to be dictating what we get, then what does happen is you set up a sort of an echo chamber. So you're interested in social change and maybe social innovation, and you're interested in international development and everything else. You click on a bunch of stories about that, and before you know it, all you're getting in your sort of feed is stuff that sort of preaches to your choir of one.
Yep.
And then suddenly you are not hearing. I mean, one of the sort of exquisite pleasures, is one of the few exquisite pleasures of getting the Globe, for instance, because it doesn't contain much pleasure anymore for me, is actually occasionally you see a Margaret Wenty column that you just make yourself read because she's just so awful. And what that does is it provokes you to think about why you think she's so awful or her ideas are so, to me, offensive. And that's a good thing, because otherwise you're just sort of, you're bathing in some tepid liberal sort of bathwater, which, everybody else is sort of bathing with the same ideas. And, you never get a shock to your own system, So, and that's a problem. I mean, that's why occasionally, I would never buy it, but occasionally if I'm traveling across the country, I pick up a free copy of the National Post, because actually some of their writers are really good writers, and most of what they write about drives me crazy. So that's a good thing. And I don't know if anybody's really come up yet with a curation that is that sort of has the cross dressers, if you will.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that's a bit of a problem.
Your book is so much. It's about, in a way, I love, how, the book's about news, it's about journalism, it's about media, et cetera, but it's about so much more than that, it seems to me. And we've got social change and democratic institutions. We're talking about censorship and ownership and corporatism and so on. I'm gonna read another quick quote here, and I so love this here, where you say this incessant echo about the need for economic growth is the meta-narrative that has shaped the contours of the developed world's behavior since the birth of the first baby boomer. It is how perversely so many governments are able to gain and maintain power by preaching economic austerity as a virtue, close quote. I mean, this is not so much about news and media anymore, is it? This is sort of your comment on the global economic gap, if I can, take my interests and sort of impose those on what you're doing here.
Oh, completely. I mean, I look at the Globe and Mail every day, as I said, and to me, it's kind of big oil telling me what it wants the world to look like. So that's my first filter for the Globe.
That's so funny.
And the National Post, looks like just small-minded, nasty people. That's their view of the world, and so you have to sort of filter immediately what you're getting. But no, I mean, our this sort of political narrative and development narrative is now well trodden, and it's well supported by large corporate interests who control media, who have a certain view of the way the world works, and they want to continue to promulgate that view and stay in power. And that's not conspiracy theory or anything else. It's just true. I mean, if there's a great book that the University of Winnipeg, I think, produced called Seeing Red, which was a book about the complicit nature of our media over the century and a half of development of Canada, that excluded Aboriginal people or derided them or completely marginalized.
And you get into that in quite a big way in the book.
Yeah, and so I mean those are deliberate acts of omission and commission that our media have taken, because it's been in their interest to create and sustain a narrative which is in their interest. And so that's why who owns media is just as important today as it's ever been. Going to Ben Bagdickian's groundbreaking book in the 80s, The Media Monopoly, that's where I was inspired to sort of pay attention to the fact that, who owns the pulpit is very much a function about who then gets to stand behind it and what they broadcast to the adoring masses. And that's as true today as ever been. But the other thing is that, and so you who have an interest in international development, and I'm sure some of your listeners do too, or who are interested in the work of philanthropic foundations, for instance, who are supposed to be funding change makers and people out on the edge of new social policy, new thinking, and everything else, or even to the UN, which commissions a massive amount of research every year, or the World Bank, into issues of public importance and everything else. How does that get mobilized? How does any of that analysis and that sort of creative thinking get mobilized in such a way that real change can happen because people get excited about? So it's not, journalism isn't just, or shouldn't be just about all the bad things going on in the world. Partly at Discourse Media, what we're trying to say is journalism can shine the light on solutions.
Nice.
The Vancouver Foundation out here, they've gone open source on their research that they support through their grants at the Vancouver Foundation, and so which I think is fascinating. And so they basically said, we're supporting all this innovative thinking and work through our foundation grants, and that should be publicly available. So that's a great move on their part. And what we're talking to them about is, well, how do you mobilize that in the public sphere? And how do you get these good ideas? There are solutions to homelessness. There are sort of better practices about, the opioid crisis in one city than another. How do you share those? How do you mobilize hopeful knowledge? How do you mobilize solutions in the public realm? Well, that should be partly the job of journalism. And then you're serving the public interest. And I think that I think there's great opportunity there, and I think it's also a way to rebuild the public's trust in journalism if we're actually helping the people make sense of a complex world in a way that gives them something they can act positively on.
Didn't you say in the book at some point, Ian, that this was not and this is going to be my Peckian paraphrase here, but not a battlefield report, but kind of a search for solutions? Absolutely,
and I think that's what we need right now. I mean, the fact is that our traditional media, the jig's up. This stuff just doesn't work, and people don't want it anymore. And so, where I think the opportunity is not to run around in the digital realm trying to find a way to, they're not paying for that anymore. Let's sort of tweak the product a little bit, or let's just find a way to con people into paying for stuff in a different way. I think there's a kind of an opportunity for a root and branch rethink of what journalism's purpose is. And if we are successful at doing that, and if we can find a way to have journalism show up in a way that doesn't offend people's intellect or offend their sensibilities, and actually gives I was just writing some notes yesterday. I thought, what is journalism really? We investigate, we inform, and my third eye was we inspire. And that's what we should be doing. I mean, at the moment, we're sort of not really investigating very much. We're misinforming for the most part, and and we add and we despair people. So I think if we can flip that on its head and get back to what we're good at, which is to do investigations. They don't all have to be gotcha moments. Just investigate interesting things in interesting ways, inform people with a narrative that's compelling and mobilizing and appeals to their sense of agency and appeals to their desire to live in a better world and help have a better world. If we can inspire them to then act, and also, I would have to say, inspire them to pay for the journalism they're getting,
right.
self-serving.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Then there may be a sweet spot there that is right in front of our eyes.
When are you going to be teaching your first course or your next course on the journalism of tomorrow, Ian? That's what I want to know. What I love about right through the book, the thread is there. You talk about boneheaded executive producers. You're not afraid to sort of call things the way you see them, and yet I see this. I see this really marvelous positive thread. This like you say, this isn't a battlefield report. This is about solution. This is discourse media. This is what you're now currently doing. That there is hope here. That there is agency. That there is a way to get involved and to make a difference. And yes, it's a serious critique, and but at the same time, it's a call to action. And for me, your introduction was lovely because you can so tell that you have this affectionate. I think affection. Can I use the word affection for journalism? For telling a story.
Completely. And I think that, I look around the people I'm working with right now and other peers and colleagues and everything else. And, there's some show ponies and some, sort of pumped up, pseudo rock star type journalists and all the usual, stuff that goes along with that. But most of these people are very serious about using their intellect and their talents and their storytelling skills and learning these skills and expanding upon them, because they believe in a better Canada. And
right.
That's not something to be disdained. And I think we've cheapened our own brand as journalists by somewhat being cowed by these publishers who've just sort of destroyed the product that we work for around us. And also, there's plenty of lazy journalists out there, just like there's probably the odd auto worker who doesn't tighten the nut on the wheel quite enough.
Sure, of course. Yeah.
But no, I think it can be a noble craft, and I think that actually. The other trend that I'm seeing that I'm really excited about in journalism is that the emphasis on being first and having a scoop and being, and competing and beating the other guy to the story. Yep. These days, content is everywhere, so it's hard to have a scoop about a car accident because the first person who reports on a car accident is the person who's in the car accident who turns on their iPhone.
It's true.
So that notion you want to be first at the scene or anything else is less important now. What I'm seeing is a trend towards really, really good, intelligent collaborations between media makers, because in the end, the story is the most important thing. And if we can figure out ways to collaborate to get more stories of importance to Canadians out on more channels so that they find it wherever they're at, I think there's real power in that, and we're having conversations with some of the larger media makers, including the CBC and other institutions across the country. We did a collaborative project with Maclean's last year.
Nice.
I mean,
I love the notion of intelligent collaboration. It's marvelous.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's the only way that we can both cover the ground we need to cover, but also restore some public faith in journalism, and I think that's an exciting trend that we wouldn't have even thought about 10 years ago.
So it was so hard for me to pick any quotes out of your book because there's so many, but I'm gonna wrap up our interview here now. Sadly, maybe we can do a part 2 in the future, Ian. I would really love to do that. But quote, old, slow, and lazy doesn't win the race. It's beyond urgent that we clear the decks and make way for the journalism of tomorrow, because the journalism of today is fast becoming yesterday's news, close quote. I hope everybody reads this book, even those who read the National Post.
Well, they should read it most of all.
It's so funny. No news is bad news. Canada's media collapse and what comes next. Ian, thank you for your time and your generosity and your sense of humor and your insights. I really appreciate it. It's been a great interview for me.
Well, a great pleasure to do it, and thanks for your interest.